Some calendars do not measure time, they measure debt. If you have found your way here, you already know this is not the kind of place that asks you to stay. It simply makes staying feel inevitable. If the darkness suits you, take your place among those who have already accepted the invitation. Mark the threshold. Let the bell toll when the next summons is ready. And if something in this story finds its way into the hours after you've stopped listening, leave it here, in the dark, where it belongs. I want to be careful about how I tell this. Not because I'm afraid of being called a liar. I've been called a liar. I've been called worse, and by people who were standing in the same town square I was standing in, who watched the same parade I watched, who ate the same funnel cake from the same vendor on the same corner, and heard the same marching band playing at that slightly underwater tempo, and still found a way afterward to explain it all differently. People are remarkable in that capacity. Once they've decided they need to explain something differently, they will find the explanation and they will believe it, and they will not feel dishonest doing so, because that is what survival looks like from the inside. I've come to understand that. I don't hold it against anyone. No. I'm careful because there is a particular kind of story that stops being yours the moment you tell it wrong. You reach for the dramatic word, you find the sharp detail, the thing that sounds like a horror story is supposed to sound, the turn of phrase designed to make a person sit up and pay a different kind of attention. And in doing so, you drop the actual thing, the quiet thing, the thing that did not come with a sound effect or a sudden image or a moment of revelation that announced itself as revelation, the thing that wore the same face as every other ordinary fact until you had laid enough ordinary facts side by side that the shape they made together was something your mind could not unform, no matter how long you sat with it afterward or how many times you returned to the individual pieces looking for the error. Something frightening precisely because it is not, taken piece by piece, frightening at all. So I'm going to tell this slowly, the way it actually happened, which means you will have to sit with a long stretch of ordinary before we get to anything else. I'm not apologizing for that. The ordinary is the point. The ordinary is where this lives. Whatever this is, it does not live in the dramatic turns. It lives in the ambient temperature of a place, in the things nobody says because everybody already knows, in a banner hung across a small town street with the date printed in navy letters against white fabric, a detail so unremarkable that you could stand beneath it for 20 years and never once think to look at what it actually said, until you did, until you had reason to. My name doesn't matter for this. The town does, and I'm not going to give you the real one. I'll call it Harwick after a road name I remember from childhood, a gravel county road with a metal sign that leaned slightly to the left, that I passed every time I rode my bicycle out to the grain elevator where my uncle worked summer afternoons. That particular ride I must have made 100 times, the heat pressing down on the back of my neck, the smell of cut grass on the first half of the route, and then the thicker, deeper smell of grain and dust on the second half, the way the gravel clicked under my tires in a rhythm that changed depending on how fast I was going. The whole experience so completely ordinary and completely mine that I can reconstruct it without effort, decades later, in rooms nothing like that road. Some things just stay in the body that way. That road doesn't appear on current county maps. I've checked more than once, at different times and through different databases. The way you check something repeatedly when the absence of a thing bothers you more than the presence of a wrong thing would. It existed when I was 9 years old. It may exist still in the physical sense, the grade, the gravel, the fence posts along both edges, but it has been removed from the official record, which in land surveying we call an abandonment, and which carries the implication, though not always the reality, that the road is no longer considered to lead anywhere worth documenting by people with the authority to decide what is worth documenting. The sign is still there the last time I drove past, leaning in the same direction at the same angle, as though the intervening decades had reached some private agreement to leave it entirely alone. That road is part of this story in a peripheral way, as most things in a small town are part of every other thing if you trace the lines long enough and have the patience to follow them where they actually go rather than where you assumed they would. Harwick, then. A farming town in the central Midwest, the kind you pass through on a two-lane state highway and mistake, if you are coming through for the first time, for the kind of place that has always been exactly this way and will continue to be exactly this way long after the last person with any reason to stop there has moved on. 2 stop signs instead of a traffic light, a grain elevator visible from half a mile out on a clear day and smellable from further on, a hot one, that specific rich and slightly fermented smell that grain makes in summer heat, which is either deeply comforting or deeply disorienting, depending entirely on whether it belongs to your childhood, and therefore to some fundamental register of what safety smells like, a diner with a woman's name on the sign. I've gone back and forth trying to remember whether it was Patricia's or Marlene's for long enough now that the uncertainty has become its own small fact, which probably says something true about how memory reorganizes itself when you've spent a long time sorting through things that carry more weight than a diner name. The diner had a counter with 6 stools and 4 booths and a pie case behind the register and coffee that was bad in a completely honest way, bad without pretense or apology, the kind of coffee that a small town makes when nobody in it has ever needed coffee to be anything other than hot and present and reliably the same every morning. A volunteer fire department. The truck always cleaner than it had any reason to be, given that the crew used it perhaps twice a year for anything that qualified as an actual emergency. A hardware store run by a man everyone called Deacon, not a religious title as far as I was ever able to determine. Just a name his father had given him for reasons lost to family memory. A name that had outlasted whatever story was originally behind it and simply become the man himself, the way some names do, thoroughly and permanently, as if the person had grown into it so completely that whatever the original name had been had gone quiet underneath it and stayed quiet. Population when I was growing up, somewhere between 1800 and 2000, depending on which year you consulted and which count you trusted. Not growing, not quite shrinking. Maintaining, which I have come to think of as its own kind of statement. A town that holds a number the way a living body holds a temperature, not because anyone decided it should, but because something in the system is continually and quietly compensating whenever the number threatens to move in either direction. Births and deaths in rough equilibrium, people who left balanced somehow by people who stayed, or by people who thought about leaving, got as far as thinking it through in some detail, and then found that the thinking never quite solidified into action. A town that had found its level and intended to keep it, and which had been keeping it for considerably longer than any of the records I eventually found could fully account for. I grew up there. Left at 19 for college 3 hours east, came back for summers in my early 20s and holidays into my late 20s, then less and less. The way return visits decrease in most people's lives as the center of gravity shifts toward wherever you've built the adult version of yourself. My parents left Harwick when my father retired south toward warmth, away from the winters, which in that part of the Midwest arrive early and without much ceremony about it. My mother's sister, my aunt, stayed. My cousin, a year younger than me, stayed, and now has a husband and a 4-year-old daughter and a house 2 blocks from the square and no apparent intention of leaving, which I understand. Even now, especially now in certain moods, late at night when I've been sitting with the folder in my desk drawer and the thinking has gone on past the point where it's useful, I have no bad feelings about Harwick. I want to say that in plain language and let it settle before I say anything else, because it is the most important single fact about everything that follows. It is easy, almost automatic when you tell a story like this one, to let the darkness you've discovered work backward through time and retroactively poison the memory of everything before it. To let the warm thing you loved become evidence for the frightening thing you later found, until your whole childhood reads as a horror story that you were simply too young and too content to recognize as one. I have refused that particular rewrite, and I refuse it still. I loved growing up in Harwick, genuinely and without qualification. And I love it still in the specific way you love a place that shaped you before you were old enough to have opinions about what shapes you. Before you were old enough to negotiate. I loved the quality of summer light on the fields in late July, when the corn was tall and the afternoon came in at that long, low angle that made everything look like a painting of itself. Slightly more golden than strictly accurate, slightly more still than a living landscape should be, as if the light were asking it to hold the pose for just a moment longer. I loved the smell of the town on Sunday mornings, which was a smell of almost nothing, a specific and irreplaceable nothing that you only fully understand after you've spent years in cities where the air is always full of competing things demanding your attention. I loved the diner, whatever its name was, and the men at the counter before 6 every morning, who had been in those approximate positions for decades and would remain until they couldn't. Their routines so deeply established they had become a kind of permanent feature, like the stools themselves. I loved the summer evenings when the light lasted until nearly 9 and the air cooled just enough that sitting on the porch steps felt like a reward the day had decided to give you for enduring the heat of it. And I loved the particular tone of the town during the festival, the way the square became briefly more than itself once a year, the string lights coming on over the booths and the crowd and the marching band, the whole of it adding up to something that felt like celebration in the oldest sense of the word, not entertainment, acknowledgement, a community looking at itself and deciding, collectively and without ceremony, that it was enough. I need that warmth to be real to you, not as ironic backdrop, not as contrast set up to be undermined, but as genuine substance, because the warmth is not incidental to the story. The warmth is structural. It is what the arrangement is built on, what makes the arrangement sustainable and invisible and transmissible across generations without paperwork. A cold town, a suffering town, a town you were already trying to escape that would be a different kind of story and probably a less frightening one, because in that story the horror would have a somewhere obvious to live. This horror has nowhere obvious. It lives inside something genuinely good. It is, in some way, I have spent years trying to articulate and have not fully managed, inseparable from the goodness itself. That is the thing I keep returning to on the nights when I let myself return to it. The festival is called the Harwick Founders Celebration, and it has been held without interruption for as long as anyone currently living in Harwick can remember, and for as long as the formal written history of the town extends, which goes back to approximately 1887, when the first record of a town meeting was entered in a ledger that I am told is still preserved in the back room of the municipal building. I haven't confirmed that recently, and I've learned over time to be careful about relying on what I haven't personally confirmed when it comes to Harwick specifically. The records there have a quality of being both entirely genuine and subtly curated, maintained the way a careful archivist maintains a collection, with a practiced and unhurried sense of what belongs on the open shelf and what belongs elsewhere, and with the confidence of someone who has been making that distinction for a very long time. The celebration itself is exactly what you'd expect from a small farming community with a long, continuous history and a population that has never had a compelling reason to change what works. There is a parade, modest and slightly improvised in the way that volunteer parades always are, always featuring the same flatbed trucks wrapped in crepe paper, always the same high school marching band, whose membership cycles through on a 4-year rotation, but whose collective tempo remains, year after year, approximately 10 beats per minute slower than the music was composed to be played. I have always thought this gave the music a quality of gentle solemnity that the faster version would have lacked entirely. A weight, an unhurriedness that felt deliberate even if it wasn't, like something being said carefully rather than performed quickly, whether that quality was intentional or simply the natural result of a band practicing in a small school gymnasium without a conductor who cared enough about tempo to fight for it. I honestly don't know, and I find I prefer not resolving that question. There is a street fair with craft vendors and food. There is a pie competition that my mother entered twice in my childhood and placed respectably in once, quietly proud of that placement for years in the way that small accomplishments in small-town settings carry their own particular and undeflatable dignity. There is a corn-eating contest that the Reinhardt family has won for so many consecutive years that the event ceased functioning as competition long ago and became instead an annual ceremony of confirmation. The Reinhardts are acknowledged, the prize is given. The town is satisfied that things remain as they should be, and everyone moves on to the Next thing, there are fireworks in the evening, modest, honest fireworks, the kind a county budget can genuinely support, reliable and unhurried, and which carry the specific pleasure of fireworks you know well enough to have developed feelings about, the anticipation of a particular color sequence, the comfort of the finale arriving exactly when experience told you it would. The pleasure of the familiar made briefly spectacular, which is perhaps the most underrated pleasure a community can offer its members. The whole celebration lasts one day. It has always lasted one day. It has always been contained, deliberate, self-sufficient, needing nothing from outside itself to be complete. The date was August 14th. I say was with intention, and I'll come to what I mean by it in time. But I want to let the date sit for a moment first, the way you let a significant fact sit before attaching its significance to it, because some facts deserve that small courtesy. August 14th. A date I carried the way you carry dates that have been repeated enough times across enough years of a life to carve a groove in you, not a date you have to remember, but a date that simply resides in you, permanent and warm. August 14th meant the smell of funnel cake from 3 blocks away when the wind was right, that specific sweet and hot and slightly caramelized smell that belongs entirely and only to outdoor summer fairs and to childhood, and to the precise intersection of the two. It meant the square strung with lights between the lampposts, the lights coming on as the evening cooled, making the whole block look like something staged, like a set built to represent itself. Which maybe is exactly what a festival always is, a community performing its own ideal version once a year, briefly, before returning to the quieter and less theatrical ordinary. It meant my mother in the light blue dress she kept for the festival alone, worn once a year and on no other occasion, which even as a young child seemed to me exactly and importantly right, that reserving something for a single occasion gives both the thing and the occasion a weight that daily use would eventually dissolve. It meant my father's annual complaint about the parking situation, delivered in nearly identical language every single year, with the resigned exasperation of a man performing a rite he has no intention of abandoning, and then his visible and uncomplicated enjoyment from the moment he finally got out of the car. It meant being allowed to stay out past 10, which, as a child, felt like genuine transgression, as if the town had briefly suspended one of the ordinary rules and was quietly inviting you to notice that rules were suspendable, that the world had more flexibility than it usually revealed. I loved it. That is not complicated. I loved it without reservation. I first noticed something was wrong, or more precisely, I noticed that something had been wrong for a very long time, quietly and entirely without announcement when I was 28 years old. I had driven back to Harwick for a long weekend in late summer with no particular purpose beyond time with my aunt and cousin, and the kind of decompression that a small-town visit provides when you've been in a city long enough to have stopped noticing how much ambient noise you carry everywhere you go, the way you stop noticing the weight of something you've been holding long enough. My aunt had a box of old photographs on the spare bedroom shelf that she'd been meaning to sort through for years, the specific kind of project that accumulates low-grade guilt every time the box is seen and not addressed, until the box and the guilt become effectively the same object in your mind. She asked if I'd help, and I said yes, because old photographs are one of the things I have a genuine fondness for, and because a concrete task felt like a better way to spend a Saturday afternoon than no concrete task. We sat at her kitchen table. The afternoon light came through the window over the sink at that late August angle, amber and slightly heavy, the light of a summer that has started to understand it is ending and has decided to make the remaining hours count. My aunt made iced tea in the tall blue glasses she'd had since before I was born, glasses so specific to that kitchen and that table and those particular afternoon hours that I cannot think of them without the whole context coming with them. She put out a plate of the cookies she always made, the ones from the clipped magazine recipe she'd kept not on paper but in muscle memory, in the particular practiced motion of her hands. The radio played country music softly from the small speaker on the counter. Nothing was urgent. Nothing was anywhere it needed to be except exactly where it was. Most of the photographs were exactly what you'd expect Christmas mornings going back 3 decades. Graduations, birthday gatherings, baby pictures from various eras with that generational shift in photographic technology that you can read like a timeline. Relatives I recognized, relatives I could only guess at from the logic of resemblance. The specific objects and furniture that marked different periods of the same household. The ordinary archive of a family that had stayed in one place long enough to accumulate one. But scattered through the box, perhaps 30 or 40 photographs across the full span of the collection were images clearly from the festival, identifiable by the string lights, the craft booths, the specific geometry of the square that I knew as well as my own handwriting. These covered roughly 50 years of the celebration, from the warm, oversaturated Kodachrome palette of the early 60s through the cooler and sharper photography of the late 90s. I separated them and began arranging them in rough chronological order, working backward from the ones I could place exactly to the ones I could only estimate based on clothing and the particular quality of the film. The banners. I noticed them gradually across several minutes of sorting, not all at once. The festival banners were stretched across the main street every year, white fabric, navy lettering, mounted on cables between the buildings on either side, visible from the intersection at the square's eastern approach. In most of the photographs where a banner was legible and facing the camera at a useful angle, the text read clearly, Harwick Founders Celebration. August 14th. That was the date I knew, the date I'd grown up with. But in a cluster of the older photographs, the ones with that early 70s warmth, slightly overexposed at the edges, the colors a little too gold. The visible banner read August 15th, and in 3 photographs from what I estimated as the late 1950s, faded to near monochrome, the banner read August 16th. I set those 6 or 7 photographs in a small separate pile without saying anything. I kept sorting. My aunt and I kept talking about family, about people in the photographs, about small memories the images surfaced and offered up. The afternoon went on at its own pace. My iced tea glass left a ring on the table. The radio cycled through its playlist twice. I kept returning to the small pile at the edge of my vision with the low, persistent attention of someone who has registered something without yet being able to say precisely what they've registered or why it has attached itself so firmly to their notice. Before I left that evening, I asked my aunt, in as casual a tone as I could honestly arrange, whether she remembered when the festival date had changed. The old photographs seemed to show a few different dates over the years. From the 15th to the 14th, it looked like, maybe even the 16th at some earlier point. Did she know anything about when or why? She paused. Brief a second, perhaps 2. The kind of pause that is short enough to miss entirely if you aren't paying close attention and long enough to mean something if you are. She said she thought the date had always been the 14th as far as she knew. I showed her the photographs. She took the faded ones to the window, held them in better light, examined them for a moment with a slight frown that was either concentration or something else I chose not to name at the time. Then she said she supposed the date must have changed at some point, probably long before her time, and that she couldn't say who had decided it or why, and that it wasn't the sort of thing she'd ever had occasion to think about. Then she asked if I wanted the leftover cookies for the drive home, and the conversation moved on in the way that conversations in small towns move on when they approach a certain kind of subject gently, by offering something else, by providing a small and pleasant alternative direction. I took the cookies. I drove home in the evening light with the flat, dark road unrolling ahead of me and the fields on both sides going dim. I thought about the dates for maybe half an hour, somewhere in the middle of the drive, and then, with the deliberate intention of someone who does not want to become a person with a theory, I put it away. I put it away for 6 years. I want to be honest about that gap because it matters to the truth of this. The thing did not follow me home in any dramatic sense. It did not disrupt my sleep or alter my work. It was a small, unresolved thing stored in the compartment where the mind keeps things it hasn't finished with but hasn't yet found the key to. And it waited there with the specific patience that small, unresolved things have, neither growing nor diminishing, just present, until something arrived 6 years later and gave it a reason to come forward. The second time I paid attention was at a funeral. My uncle, my father's brother, a man who had lived in Harwick his entire life, and whom I had loved with the specific and undemonstrative affection you develop for people who are steady without performing steadiness, who do necessary things without requiring you to notice, who say something sharp and funny so rarely that when they do, it arrives with the full weight of its rarity every single time, died in the late summer. His heart, which had been making its intentions known through 2 years of incremental warnings that he addressed as required, and then chose to live around in the particular way that practical men of his generation treated unwelcome information about themselves as things to be managed, not contemplated, finally made its final decision. He was in his bed. My aunt found him in the morning. The doctor said it was fast, which is what is always said, which everyone always needs to be true, and which may well have been. He died on August 13th. I drove back for the funeral 3 days later. The house became full in the way that houses in small towns become full after a loss that has touched nearly everyone, full primarily of food, because food is what people know how to offer when the feeling is too large and too specific for language to carry. Casseroles and covered dishes and pies arriving in a slow, continuous wave from neighbors and church members and people connected to the family by threads that would take a genealogist to map properly. The afternoon was warm and long. The particular sound of a small community arranging itself around a shared grief filled the rooms. Low voices, the scraping of chairs being repositioned, the specific acoustic of a house holding more people than it usually holds, and beneath all of that, occasional laughter at a remembered story about the dead man, which is both jarring and deeply right, both startling and necessary. I was at the kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon, my plate half finished, the conversation around me rising and receding the way conversation does at these events, when an older woman from the church came and sat down across from me. She was in her late 80s, small, white-haired, composed with the particular composure of women who have attended enough funerals to have made a lasting peace with attendance itself, for whom grief is no longer a disruption but a familiar room. She offered her condolences about my uncle in warm and practiced language, the language of someone who knows how to do this because they have done it many times and understand that the doing itself is what matters, not originality. We spoke briefly about him, about the specific and quiet qualities of the man. And then there was a natural pause in the conversation, the kind that opens briefly in the middle of events like this. And she said in the same gentle and entirely matter-of-fact tone she'd been using throughout, without any shift in register whatsoever, at least he went before the festival. I looked at her. She said it the way you'd observe that the weather had been merciful, the way you'd note that someone had managed to finish their repairs before the first winter storm. A small and specific mercy, noted and acknowledged, entirely self-evident to any reasonable person at this table. I asked her what she meant. Something recalibrated in her face. Not alarm, not guilt. The careful, measured recalibration of someone who has just understood that the person they're speaking to is missing a context she had assumed was simply present, distributed by the air of the place itself, absorbed in childhood, along with everything else that Harwick gives to the people it raises. She looked at me for a moment with the measuring look of someone deciding exactly how much to say, and then said gently and with precision, "Well, people around here have always found it sensible not to have serious health trouble in the week before the celebration." Then she put her hand on mine briefly, warmly, the gesture of a door being closed with care, and stood and moved across the room to speak to someone else, leaving me with my cold plate and the specific weight of what she had just said sitting on the table between me and everything else. I found my cousin before I left for the evening. We went out to the back porch where the air was cooling and the yard was going soft blue in the early dusk, the fireflies just beginning, and I told her what the woman had said, word for word, in the careful way I report things when I want the report to be accurate rather than colored by my reaction to what I'm reporting. My cousin listened completely, without interrupting, her face still in the way that means full attention rather than absence. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said the old ones had always believed that. She said she wouldn't think too much about it if she were me. She said there were probably towns all across the Midwest where people believed stranger things about stranger subjects, and that belief and fact were not always the same size, and that it was worth keeping that distinction available. I said, "What do they believe specifically? Not the general shape of it, the actual content of the belief." She looked at me for a long moment, the look of someone deciding not just what to say, but how much of what they already know to release into the air between you. Then she said quietly, and without decoration, that someone always dies the day before. That's what people here know. I said, "The day before the festival?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Every year." She said, with a deliberateness I would continue to think about for a long time after, "People here have always known it." I want to be precise about what I did after that conversation, because the precision matters for understanding what kind of person was bringing this kind of attention to this kind of subject. I did not go home that night and start making calls or pulling records. I'm a land surveyor, was at that time, and the professional instinct of the work is methodical patience above all else. You separate what you have observed from what you have inferred from what you have merely assumed. You do not allow a pattern to harden into a conclusion just because you've identified 3 points and drawn a line between them. You find more points first. You check your instrument for drift. You account for your own position before declaring with any confidence where anything else is. The claim, as I understood it from 2 separate women who had each delivered it with the complete calm of something requiring no defense, was that one person died in Harwick every year on the day before the founders' celebration, August 13th, for the years when the festival ran on August 14th. I filed it consciously and deliberately as folk belief, as the accumulated sediment of collective memory, the pattern-seeking of generations who experienced August deaths and remembered them and passed the memory forward, whose descendants added their own Augusts to it, and so on, until a structure of belief was built that felt indistinguishable from knowledge because it was so old and so uniformly held, but which might not survive contact with a complete and unselected record examined by someone with no stake in the outcome. I filed it as folk belief. I maintained that filing, but I kept the banner dates somewhere in the back of the mind that keeps things without being asked to. August 16th to August 15th to August 14th, moving forward through the calendar across the photographs with the slow directional consistency of something that did not vary in its direction regardless of how long you watched it. 1 day per decade, roughly. Consistent enough to be a pattern. Not so neat as to seem arranged, the particular combination that is the hardest to dismiss. And I kept, though I didn't yet have the words, because I hadn't yet found the ledger. Something like the shape of a sentence that I would read the following year. The interval is not arbitrary. I didn't have those words yet. But I had the shape they would eventually fill, and a shape without its name is its own specific category of unease. It was nearly a year after the funeral before I found the ledger. I was back in Harwick on a matter of property and inheritance that required my presence and left me with afternoon hours that needed filling. On the 3rd day, I walked to the public library, a short walk from my aunt's house, and libraries have always been places where my thinking clarifies in a way specific to that environment, something about their organized quiet, their deliberate arrangement of accumulated human effort, their quiet argument that paying attention to recorded things is a worthwhile way to spend time. The County Historical Society maintained a small archive in a converted room at the library's back. Donated family histories, bound newspaper volumes, photograph collections in archival sleeves organized by decade on labeled shelves. A glass display case with objects someone had designated historically significant, an arrowhead collection, an old surveying chain, a small brass compass with a hairline crack across its face. On a shelf along the inner wall, 12 bound ledgers from the Harwick Founders Association, spanning the 1890s through the early 1960s, at which point the association had been folded into the general structure of civic governance. The archivist on duty was a young woman in her mid-20s who seemed genuinely pleased to have a visitor and told me I was welcome to anything on the open shelves, which I noted with the specific attention I now gave to the phrase open shelves when I heard it in Harwick. I pulled the ledgers without a purpose I could have named at the time. Records of festival planning expenses, vendor contracts, committee rosters, motions moved and seconded and recorded in the slightly ceremonial institutional language of small organizations that took their own procedures seriously because their procedures were one of the ways they knew themselves to be real. Dry, but carrying the specific texture of a community speaking to itself across generations through the only medium formal enough to preserve what mattered to it. I went through 3 volumes at the reading table before I found the date notations. Each annual record opened with a brief administrative section that included, among other entries, the official date of that year's celebration. In the ledgers from the 1890s, the date was listed as August 18th or 19th variable in the earliest years, which I noted without yet knowing what to do with the noting. By the 1910s, it had settled to August 17th. By the 1930s, August 16th. Through the 1950s, August 15th. The most recent ledger in the collection from the early 1960s showed August 15th still. So between the early 1960s and my own childhood, the date had moved one more time. To August 14th, 1 day per decade, consistent in direction, never reversing, never pausing, moving with the unhurried regularity of something that had made its decision a very long time ago and saw no reason to revisit it. I photographed every date notation page methodically, working through the stack in order. Then I went through the expense records with the second and more careful attention they deserved, and I found the line item there in every annual budget, in every ledger, under the copperplate heading, Pre-Celebration Remittance. A fixed figure each year, small but invariable and precisely noted, adjusting across the decades in the approximate way of long-standing institutional payments that are never formally renegotiated, but simply understood to keep pace with the world they operate in. Dispersed each year to an entity recorded simply as the Association. Not the Founders Association, not any organization with a complete name, just the Association. As if the full name were too familiar to require stating, as if the people keeping these books existed in a world where there was only one association that ever needed paying, and everyone who would ever read this line already knew which one. I photographed every instance, then I read the final page of the oldest ledger, the 1890s volume. At the bottom, separated from the formal columns by deliberate white space, was a note in the same careful copperplate hand as everything else. The annual date shall be maintained according to the understanding agreed upon at the founding. Any adjustment must be made by formal vote of the committee and recorded here. Adjustments shall not be made lightly, nor in violation of the interval. The interval is not arbitrary. That was all. No description of the founding understanding. No explanation of what the interval measured or what violation would mean in practice. No name, no date, no indication of what circumstance had prompted someone to set this particular note apart from the ordinary columns. Just the quiet, slightly grave certainty of a man writing for readers who already knew what he meant, because they were Harwick people, because they held the common knowledge, because the understanding had been distributed not in documents but in the practice space between what people said and what they already carried when they said it. I returned the ledger to its place. I thanked the archivist. I walked home through the warm late afternoon past the yards, past the green-painted door of the hardware store, past the diner and its particular smell of coffee and pie and something indefinably itself, and I thought about a single sentence the entire way, all through dinner, through the following morning, through the drive home. The interval is not arbitrary. That winter, I went through the death notices in the county newspaper archive. I want to describe this work as it actually was, not as it sounds in retrospect. It was not exciting and it was not frightening in any given hour of it. It was the work of a methodical person doing methodical work, tedious, frequently inconclusive, interrupted by gaps in the digitization and by the persistent ambiguity of records that were made for purposes entirely different from the ones I was putting them to. I was working through the Millard County Courier Archive, the regional paper, digitized through a state historical project, looking at death notices for Harwick residents in the window of August 10th through 15th, going back as far as the available record extended, which was 1941, with any reliability. Some evenings I went through 3 years and found nothing usable. Some years the archive was incomplete for exactly the dates I needed. Some names I couldn't confirm as Harwick residents, rather than the nearby communities whose notices also appeared in the same paper. The data was messy in all the ways that real data is messy, resistant to clean conclusions, full of the kind of ambiguity that requires judgment calls you're never entirely comfortable making, riddled with the specific frustrations of asking a record to answer questions it was never designed to address. But the pattern was there. I'll say that plainly and without building toward it, because the plainness is the only honest approach. Across more than 60 years of available records, imperfect, incomplete, full of gaps and ambiguities and individual cases I couldn't resolve with confidence, the death notices for Harwick residents published in the immediate vicinity of August 13th appeared at a rate measurably higher than the baseline for that same calendar window in other months, and higher than the surrounding days within August itself. When I worked backward into the years when the festival had run on August 15th, the elevation was concentrated on August 14th. In the small number of notices I could locate from the festival's August 16th era, the elevation was on August 15th, always the day before. Not with mechanical precision, not without exceptions, without years where I found nothing, without years where the record offered more than one name. The data was not clean, but the shape was directionally consistent across enough years and enough base date adjustments that I could not, as a person trained to assess probability and the weight of margins, use the word coincidence and feel that the word was carrying its full required load. I returned to the database repeatedly through the winter, looking for the error in my method, the confirmation bias in my search criteria, the gap in my framework that would allow the whole structure to collapse into something more comfortable. I found small corrections, I adjusted individual counts, I tightened my criteria twice. I did not find a way to make the pattern disappear. I called my cousin the following spring on a Sunday afternoon when the light outside my apartment was the non-committal gray of early spring, the sky not yet ready to make promises. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with my notes spread in front of me, and I called her and told her everything. All of it in order, without dramatizing. The banner photographs, the ledger migration, the expense line item, and its abbreviated payee, the founding note, the 6 decades of newspaper records and what they showed. I told it the way I would tell a client about a boundary discrepancy. Here is what the record shows. Here is what the physical evidence shows. Here is where they diverge, and here is what I cannot account for with any tool I have available. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, choosing which answer quiet. The silence of someone who already has several formed responses and is deciding which one this particular conversation requires. Then she said, "I've known about the dates for a long time. I asked her to tell me." She said her mother, my aunt, who had offered cookies over old photographs and paused for 2 seconds before saying she didn't know anything about the date, had told her when she was 16. Not as a secret revealed, not with drama or ceremony, with the low-level, matter-of-fact tone that practical knowledge takes in small towns when it has been carried long enough to have lost any sense of itself as unusual. She said my aunt had told her that the town had always understood in the way communities understand things that don't need to be written down because writing them down would be redundant, that the festival required something, that what it required was paid one day before every year, that this requirement had never in the living memory of anyone in Harwick been experienced as directed at a specific person or delivered with malice. It was a timing, a gentle and final acceleration of what the year had already started in someone. The arrangement did not choose who, it chose when. And the when every year was always the day before. I asked, "And what does the town receive in return?" She said, "Everything." She said the farms in Harwick were good in ways that farms 20 miles in any direction were not reliably good. The weather had been kind to Harwick across its entire recorded history in ways that the general regional weather had not been consistently kind to the communities around it. There had been no serious fire in the town's history, no significant flood, no epidemic that took hold. No single economic catastrophe of the kind that had quietly unmade dozens of similar Midwestern towns across the past 100 years. No factory closing, no mine collapse, no foreclosure wave that swept through and left a hollowed-out shell behind. People in Harwick lived long mostly. The children were healthy. The old were comfortable. The general quality of daily life sustained a warmth that the people born there experienced as simply normal, as the baseline of what a place could be, because they had never been anywhere long enough to understand that most places do not feel this way. She said, "People have always understood that has a cost. The cost is paid once a year, one life from the population the day before the celebration. It takes someone already failing, whose body has already been moving toward its end for reasons having nothing to do with the arrangement. The arrangement doesn't create the death. It curates the timing. And the timing is what allows everything else to remain as it is year after year, in a way that the people inside it experience as simply the nature of the place." I asked, who made this agreement? At the founding? What actually happened? She said she didn't know the full history and believed no one did anymore, not in any complete or verifiable form. There were old stories older than the 1887 ledger, older than the formal name of the town, going back to when the settlement was still deciding what it was and what it was willing to accept in exchange for what it needed from land that had been known before the settlers came for a long time by other names and under other arrangements. She said the old stories didn't name anyone. They only said that the land had offered something and that someone had said yes, and that the yes had held, and that the holding had made Harwick everything it became and everything it still was. I asked about the date, about the movement. She said yes. People here are aware of that. She said there were stories in her mother's generation that in the beginning, before the ledger, before the association, before the formal structures that gave the arrangement its procedural shell, the date had been in September or even October, when the harvest was in and the cost could be paid at a comfortable distance from the living center of summer, the warm heart of the year. That whoever made the agreement had believed the date was fixed, was part of the terms, was immovable by definition, and then discovered that it wasn't, that it moved. One day, forward per generation, slow and absolutely consistent and completely indifferent to how that movement was received by the people inside it. As if patience were not a quality the arrangement needed to exercise because time was simply not a pressure that applied to it, the way it applied to the people living within it. She said, people figured out a long time ago they couldn't stop it, so they stopped trying to stop it and learned instead to know where it was. They move the festival when the date moves. They plan around it. They pass the knowledge to the next generation at the right age, in the right tone, without panic and without drama, because panic helps nothing and drama would make it into something other than what it is, which is simply a condition of the place. Like the way the water table sits, or the way the wind comes in from the northwest in November. It is what Harwick is. They have never known Harwick to be otherwise. I said, it's on August 14th now, one more move and it's August 13th, and then 12, and then 11. And at some point she said, yes. People here think about that. I asked, does anyone know when it stops? Whether it stops? She was quiet for a moment that was different from the others in its texture, longer and heavier. The quiet of someone who has sat with an unanswerable question for years and has made a kind of peace with its remaining unanswered, without mistaking that peace for an answer. Then she said, I don't think anyone knows that. I think that is the part that has always been on the other side of what any person in Harwick can see from where they're standing. We stayed on the phone for a while after that. Before we said goodnight, she told me something I have carried every single day since. She said, the thing that makes this impossible to be simply angry about, the thing that makes it impossible to be simply anything about, is that the town is fine. It is genuinely, completely structurally fine, in a way that is not performance and is not compensation, and is not the carefully managed appearance of a place that knows it ought to be worse than it is. It is the fineness of a place that has always been fine for so long that the fineness has become the material the place is made of. And knowing about the arrangement doesn't change that. It doesn't change the July light or the Sunday morning smell or the length of the summer evenings or the quality of the coffee or the specific pleasure of the fireworks you know well enough to have feelings about. It doesn't make anyone want to leave. Nobody who grew up in Harwick and holds this knowledge has ever left because of it. She paused, and in the pause I could hear the specific quiet of a Harwick night, the particular and unhurried silence of a town that has always slept easily and has no apparent reason to stop. She said, "My mother told me about this when I was 16. I have lived here every year since. I have a daughter who will grow up here, and I think about the arrangement, and I cannot make myself leave, and I genuinely cannot determine from the inside whether that's because the place is worth what it costs, or because I was born into it and cannot see its edges clearly enough from where I stand to make an honest accounting of it. And I don't know how you'd tell the difference. From inside, it just feels like home. It just feels like home in the way that the best version of that word means the place that is simply yours, that fits you in ways no other place quite does, that you return to in your mind before you sleep. I think that's what frightens me most on the nights I let myself be frightened. Not the death, the fact that I cannot determine with any confidence which of my contentments are genuinely mine and which were part of what was purchased, and whether the question even has an answer, or whether the not knowing is itself part of the terms. I have been back to Harwick twice since that call. The most recent visit was in the spring, a practical trip, 2 days, nothing connected to the festival or the calendar or any of this. My aunt made dinner the first evening, the same plates she had owned since before I was born, the same tablecloth with its embroidered border worn to a particular softness by decades of washing, the same deliberate warmth of a kitchen that has been the center of family for a very long time and knows it. My cousin brought her daughter over after dinner. The girl is 4 years old, healthy and brown-eyed, and entirely absorbed in the comprehensive and serious project of being 4, which is a project that requires most of one's available attention and leaves very little over for anything else. I sat on the kitchen floor with her after the adults had finished the evening's conversation, and we looked at a picture book together, and she explained the pictures to me with the calm and absolute authority of someone who has recently learned a great deal and wants to make sure the information is properly distributed. She has her mother's way of listening and her own way of speaking and the completely specific quality of a child who has been loved well in a place that was good to her. She lives 2 blocks from the square. She will grow up hearing the marching band every August, playing slightly slower than it should. And she will think that is simply how festival music sounds. And she will be right for Harwick, for all the years she spends in it. I drove through the square the morning I left. Slowly, without any practical reason to be slow, simply needing to look at it once more with what I now know laid over what I remember. The municipal building, brick and low, with its flagpole and its modest sign and its back room holding records I haven't tried to access in several years. The diner, still there, still open. The early light burning inside, 2 figures visible at the counter through the window. The before 6 men, the inheritors of the stools, the continuation of something that has been continuing since before I was born. The hardware store's green door under its new name. The lampposts with their empty bracket hooks waiting with the specific patience of things that know August is coming. The banner fixtures at either end of the street, the anchor points between which, every August, the white and navy banner is stretched. Harwick Founders Celebration. The date below, August 14th. For now. I pulled over and sat with the engine idling. The morning was cool and lightly misty, the kind of spring morning that holds the memory of winter still in its edges while allowing the possibility of warmth somewhere ahead. A woman I didn't recognize walked a small dog along the far sidewalk, taking her time, the dog conducting its systematic investigation of each lamppost base with the focused professional dedication that dogs bring to this particular work. From the residential block behind the square, a lawnmower started and ran for 30 seconds and then stopped. The diner's light held steady. The banner fixtures were empty and waiting, completely ordinary. Every visible thing, every audible thing, completely and unreservedly ordinary. I thought about the man who wrote that note in the 1890s ledger, about what he believed when he wrote it, whether he thought the movement would stop at some point, whether there had been an argument in an earlier committee meeting about whether the date could simply be refused, whether a year could pass without adjustment, whether the arrangement had terms that could be challenged by people willing to bear the cost of the challenge, whether that argument had ended in defeat or in something worse than defeat, something that made everyone in the room understand simultaneously why the argument would never be made again. The ledger didn't record any such meeting. The ledger recorded only that adjustments shall not be made lightly, nor in violation of the interval. I thought about my aunt's 2-second pause over old photographs. I thought about the old woman's hand on mine at the funeral, warm and certain and kind. I started the car and drove the state highway out of town, past the gas station, past the last houses and the fields opening up, past the turnoff for Harwell Road with its leaning sign still pointing down a road the county has decided not to know about. I didn't turn. I have not turned there in years. I sat at the final intersection before the highway for a long moment with the turn signal ticking in the quiet car. A red-winged blackbird was on the fence post at the corner, that vivid red mark against the black of its wing startling in the mist. The bird sitting with its particular upright composure as if it had been there since before I arrived and intended to remain after I left. The fields ran flat to the horizon on all sides. The sky was the pale and undecided blue of a spring morning that hasn't yet committed to what it's going to be. The bird lifted eventually without urgency and was gone. I thought about my cousin's daughter explaining the picture book, the authority of her voice, the town she was going to grow up in, the Augusts she was going to stand inside, the banner she was going to stand beneath, and the date on it, and the date it would eventually become, and the date after that, and after that, moving steadily forward through the calendar with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry, toward whatever is waiting on the other side of the days it has already moved through. Then I turned onto the highway and drove. I'll say one more thing, and then I will stop. I keep the photographs, the banner dates, printed and sleeved and organized in a folder in my desk drawer alongside the ledger pages, the expense columns with their abbreviated payee, the newspaper printouts annotated in my own handwriting from the long winter evenings when I was still in the process of not yet knowing, and the knowing was just beginning to take shape. I look at them sometimes, not often, not in any ritual way, just occasionally, the way you look at something you've decided not to resolve but also cannot set down entirely. I keep them not because I believe they constitute proof that any authority would know how to receive or act on. I keep them because it seems important that somewhere outside of Harwick, outside the warm, self-sustaining, quietly radiant air of a town that has been good to its people longer than its oldest record, and intends to remain so the record exists in hands that didn't grow up knowing what it means. Someone outside the common knowledge has it written down. Someone who found it the long way, through the particular patience of a profession built on determining where things actually are rather than where the record says they are. And who found this time that both sets of coordinates were true, and that the truth of both that held together was the thing that had no comfortable place. Then 11. And the town will still be beautiful. The corn will still come in good. The pie competition will still be won by the Reinhardts, more likely than not. The diner will still have bad coffee and the fire truck will still be cleaner than it has any reason to be. That's the thing that stays with me when I sit with all of it in the quiet. Not the dying, the living. How good the living is and how completely ordinary it looks from inside it, and how the people who were born there and will die there go to bed each night in that ordinary goodness without any apparent need to ask who made the payment. They already know it wasn't them. This year.